Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we start digging into European history, especially the 20th century, the mental image you get is almost always violence.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Right. Like you picture trench warfare or political revolutions, dictators rising and falling, or just borders constantly shifting on a map.
It's all very loud history.
Exactly. It's loud. But if you actually zoom out and you look at the sources we're unpacking today, what fundamentally changed the day-to-day human experience,
Right.
what actually altered the trajectory of a human life from birth to death, wasn't a treaty.
No, it really wasn't.
It was a syringe, it was a pill,
Mm.
or, a petri dish. And today's mission is to really explore that intersection of modern medicine and ethics. This is actually a major historical shift covered in AP European history, specifically topic 9.12 for those of you tracking with the curriculum.
And it's what I like to call the quiet revolution. While the politicians were arguing over ideology, the scientists were effectively rewriting the rules of the human condition. We're moving from a state of basically biological submission to one of biological control.
Biological submission. That is it's a really strong phrase, but looking at the source material, it's incredibly accurate for most of human history, isn't it?
It is. I mean, think about it. For millennia, the major events of life, birth, illness, death, they were viewed as external forces. They happened to you. You were born. You likely caught something we consider completely trivial today.
And you died young.
Right. Your biology was just your destiny. If nature or, divinity dealt you a certain hand, you played it. There was no redraw.
You prayed, you hoped for the best, and you accepted the outcome.
Exactly. But the narrative arc of the last 100 years in the West is humanity basically grabbing the steering wheel. We decided we weren't just going to accept the hand we were dealt. We were going to stack the deck.
But as we're going to see today, when you start playing dealer with nature, the house eventually comes looking for its cut.
Oh, absolutely. There is always a cost.
And that cost is what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We aren't just talking about a biology lesson here. We're talking about the fallout. We've got three main pillars we're going to hit today. First, the start of life, how we gain the power to choose when or even if reproduction happens.
Which is a massive shift in human agency.
It's huge. Second, the end of life, or rather the postponement of it, and the absolute economic nightmare that success created for the modern welfare state.
Living longer isn't cheap.
No, it's not. And third, the fierce ethical battles, because when you start interfering with life, you run headfirst into centuries of religious tradition and, of course, the incredibly dark shadow of eugenics.
It's the classic case of our technology just completely outpacing our philosophy.
So let's start right at the beginning, literally. The creation of life. Or, in the context of the mid-20th century, the prevention of it. In history, we talk a lot about agency, right? Who has power? Who makes the decisions?
Right.
But for women, prior to the 1960s, agency was fundamentally limited by biology.
It was the ultimate glass ceiling. But it was made of biology, not glass. If you look at the trajectory of a woman's life in the early 1900s, according to all the demographic sources, it was almost entirely dictated by her reproductive cycle.
Because there was no reliable way to decouple intimacy from procreation.
Exactly. Education, career, long-term planning, all of that was completely contingent on whether or not she became pregnant.
Enter the birth control pill. And we have to talk about Margaret Sanger here, who the sources highlight as a major driving force.
Right, the American feminist who essentially hunted down the funding for this.
Yeah, she was relentless. The mainstream medical establishment wasn't exactly rushing to fund a magic pill for women to control pregnancy. So Sanger basically willed the research into existence financially.
It was considered a radical pursuit at the time. But so what? The reason this is so pivotal for you as the listener to understand is that when the oral contraceptive pill finally arrived, it used hormones to prevent pregnancy. It completely decoupled biological necessity from personal choice.
Which didn't just change the bedroom, it changed the boardroom.
Exactly. It changed the university.
Yeah.
Think about the macroeconomics. Suddenly, half the population could plan a career trajectory 5, 10, 20 years into the future with a degree of certainty that had never existed before in human history.
It's the absolute cornerstone of second-wave feminism. You can't have a massive political movement demanding equal footing in the workplace if you don't first have control over the biological reality of maternity leave or child rearing. The pill made the political movement practically possible.
It severed the link between sex and reproduction. And that is a fundamental shift in our species. But, that control cut both ways. It wasn't just about preventing conception before it happened.
Right.
It was also about what happens after conception occurred. We have to talk about abortion.
Now, obviously, this is still a massive politically charged issue today. And just to be clear to everyone listening, our goal here isn't to take a side on modern politics, but to look at what the historical sources actually tell us about the 20th century.
Right, we're just mapping the shift in the timeline.
And the shift wasn't that abortion suddenly started happening. It had been an ancient practice. The shift was entirely in how it was done, the scientific precision.
It was the medicalization of the procedure. For most of history, ending a pregnancy was a desperate, incredibly dangerous undertaking. You were dealing with infection, hemorrhage.
Lack of sterilization.
Exactly. It was a massive gamble with death.
And then comes the 20th century 1-2 punch, antiseptics and antibiotics.
Those two technologies changed everything. Antiseptics allowed for a sterile environment, and antibiotics provided a safety net against the bacterial infections that historically killed the patient.
So the technology transformed abortion from this incredibly dangerous back alley act into a safer, regulated medical elective.
Which is exactly what brought it into the public square. When it was a dangerous secret, the state could largely ignore it. But once it became a standard medical procedure, it forced society and the state to figure out how to regulate it.
Right. But while science was mastering how to stop a birth, it was simultaneously figuring out how to flip the script on infertility.
Yes, in vitro fertilization, IVF.
Which literally translates to in glass.
It's a wild concept when you really stop and think about the history of it. For thousands of years, infertility was just the end of the road.
It was viewed as a judgment. God has closed the womb.
That fatalism was deeply ingrained in the culture. If you couldn't conceive, that was your lot in life. You adopted or you went without. But then you hit a major milestone in 1978 in England.
The birth of the first test tube baby.
Right, and IVF replaced that religious fatalism with medical agency. It united egg and sperm in a lab to literally expand family structures.
We were essentially saying, we're not going to wait on fate anymore, but that actually transitions us perfectly into our next pillar, because moving past selective breeding to directly manipulating the genetic code, that's a whole new frontier.
The genetic frontier.
Yeah.
From selection to direct alteration.
And the promise here is incredible, right? According to the scientific sources, scientists suddenly had the capability to cure genetic diseases at their source by altering DNA.
Which sounds undeniably good. You're curing diseases before they even manifest.
Yeah.
But the peril, the immediate tension that the sources highlight is that this isn't just curing a cold.
Right.
You are intervening in the natural order at the embryonic level. You're altering the blueprint.
And taking control of that blueprint has consequences.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second main part of our roadmap today, the economic paradox. Because all these technologies we just talked about, they worked really, really well.
Almost too well.
European lifespans extended significantly,
Yeah.
which sounds like a massive victory until you look at the balance sheet of the welfare state.
It's what we call the success problem. You have to put this in the context of the post-war era. Europe was rebuilding, and you had the implementation of these massive cradle-to-grave welfare states.
The promise was that the state would fund your care from birth until death.
Exactly. But that promise was made based on 1940s and 1950s life expectancies. The math made sense when people worked until they were 65, retired, relied on state care for maybe a decade, and then passed away.
There was a large base of young workers paying taxes to support a relatively small group of retirees.
But then modern medicine kicks into high gear. Better pharmaceuticals, heart bypasses, cancer treatments. Suddenly, people aren't dying at 70, they're living to 85, 90.
So you have this aha moment in the sources where you realize living longer is fantastic for the individual, but it is devastatingly expensive for the state.
It's a demographic inversion. The aging population requires significantly more medical and day-to-day care, which requires drastically higher taxes to fund.
And that creates immense tax tension. It's a recurring social conflict. The working population, the younger people, often resist this increased financial burden. They're basically being asked to sustain the prolonged lives of the elderly at the expense of their own economic mobility.
It broke the intergenerational contract. And it's a paradox because the better the medicine gets, the worse the economic crisis becomes.
Which is a heavy thing to think about. We besieged the early death, but we didn't figure out who was going to pay the bill for the extra decades.
Right.
But if we want to talk about heavy conflicts, we have to move to our third pillar, the moral battleground. Because technology was moving way faster than ethics, And that led to some massive friction.
And you can't talk about that friction in European history without talking about religion, specifically the Roman Catholic Church.
And again, looking at the source text objectively, the church's objections weren't just random pushback. They were rooted in a very specific theology.
The core belief is that human life is created in the image of God. Therefore, divine agency alone, not human science, should control what they call the opening and closing of the womb.
So when humans step in with the pill or IVF, the church views that as forcibly manipulating fertility. It's seen as humanity arrogantly trying to play God.
Exactly. IVF turns the creation of life into a laboratory procedure rather than a divine act. And regarding abortion, the church's stance is that life begins at conception, making the procedure, in their theological framework, murder.
This created a huge collision with tradition. You have a secularizing European society embracing scientific agency, colliding head-on with an ancient institution defending biological fatalism as a divine right.
And that religious conflict was intense.
Yeah.
But there's another ethical battleground here, and it's arguably the darkest concern in the entire deep dive.
The shadow of eugenics.
Right. Whenever we talk about genetic engineering, about altering human DNA to fix diseases or improve traits, we have to look at the historical context of the 20th century.
Because Europe had already seen what happens when a state decides to take control of human biology to weed out undesirables.
We are talking about Hitler's final solution. The sources frame the Holocaust not just as a political genocide, but as a horrific eugenic experiment to try and engineer an Aryan genealogy.
They wanted to forcefully direct human evolution by eliminating anyone they deemed genetically unfit.
So fast forward to modern genetic engineering. When scientists say, hey, we can alter human characteristics at the fertilized egg level to prevent a disease, the immediate modern fear is that this technology could be misused.
Right. It's the fear of reviving those dangerous eugenic ideologies, but this time doing it under the very polite guise of medical improvement.
It's the slippery slope.
Yeah.
If you can edit out a devastating illness, what stops a society from editing out traits they just don't prefer?
It forces us to ask who decides what a defect actually is.
Exactly. And that fear is why the ethical regulations around genetic engineering are so incredibly fiercely debated today.
It really brings us to a synthesis of everything we've covered. I mean, think about the journey we just took. Over the last century, we completely gained control over birth. We extended human life by decades, albeit at a massive economic cost to the welfare state.
And in doing so, we opened a total Pandora's box of ethical dilemmas.
What's your final take on this, looking at all the sources we've unpacked?
My final take is that this entire period proves something fundamental. Technology absolutely enhances our physical well-being, but it forces us to constantly, endlessly renegotiate our cultural norms and the actual role of the state. We solved the biological problems, but we created massive sociological ones.
Every medical solution birthed a new political or ethical crisis.
Yeah.
Which leaves us with a really provocative final thought for everyone listening today. Something for you to mull over. We've talked about the history, the policies, the religious pushback, but think about the future. If we now possess the actual scientific tools to play God, to alter our own genetics and completely control our reproduction, have we actually prepared ourselves for the responsibility of defining what a desirable human trait is?
That is the ultimate question.
Or by taking the steering wheel of our own biology, are we just doomed to repeat the darkest mistakes of our past, but this time with better technology? Think about it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you later.